Welcome, Adventure. I'm GM Coblin, and today, along with the season, we're going to be talking about your horror games and what you can do to bring it up to the next level, more than just dimming the lights and some dollar store candles, into something that maybe your players will truly dread and remember. If you want more in this ghoulish coming season, or if you just have some comments and some horrible tips, place them in the comment section below. Remember to like and subscribe, and let's get into what you can do to make your game horrifying. So a lot of things happen around this season. Everyone gets their parties together, or they find costumes, but I always find it to be a special occasion to roll with those special one-shots, or maybe two-shots if it takes too long, games that are involving horror. I usually do seasonal games for at least some of my players. But one thing when it comes to horror that I find is that people that want to make horror campaigns, I think it works best whenever they're shorter. Now, not to say that you can't run a darker, more grisly campaign, but having a horror campaign be shorter, at least in the number of sessions, is going to help because your players are going to have less time to get accustomed to what you're going to throw at them. So you're looking at shortening the session and not worrying about having a 17 level campaign that is all horrors and screams, because eventually, just like we do when we watch too many horror movies or the same thing over and over again, it kind of deadens us to it a little bit. So I always recommend, if you're new, to run a module. And something, if you can, being from Pathfinder, you can run, and I've seen this a lot online, just the mansion part for the second book of Rise of the Rune Lords. And this mansion is divided up into several floors. It has haunts and stuff for your players to have to worry about, each one associated to a different player. First, let's talk about what makes a good horror campaign. So, being that most of us are longtime players or video games, most of the time, your players are not just sitting back scared of the main event. It's not just the big fight. Yeah, they might spend a round or two buffing up, but most of the time they don't turn around and decide to leave. The horror comes from what leads up to that final battle or the meeting where hopefully they can defeat it. Or it comes from lack of information. Now, you can do the old overwhelming threat, and it's not a bad idea whenever you're doing a horror campaign. You lead your players in to a scenario. You don't tell them what they're facing. In fact, you never use it by its actual name. The reasoning for this is when you start to define it in mechanical terms, what you're going to do is you're going to have your players start to treat it only as a mechanic. In which case, well, they will only look for it in a way that they can use this buff or this ability to negate it. You get rid of any of that terror. Also, if you happen to have them meet it earlier on, long before the climax where hopefully they defeat the monster or they all die, I recommend having it completely overwhelm them. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to use a completely different monster. Low-level parties, this is easy because at the start of your campaign, maybe they have no way of dealing with regeneration, or they can't get past its hardness. Also, finding a way to split your party up can add to that nervousness that leads up to that terror. And having it be an overwhelming threat is much easier when they only have one player to deal with. Or if there's an attack and a player is injured, and then it takes an NPC that they were talking to. Making it seem like an actual threat, instead of just something that they can kill in 3 rounds, is what you need to do. Another way that I've heard of this is, I believe it was a false Hydra, where your party, for the most part, is only dealing with one part of it throughout the entire campaign, either a tentacle, and I've done this with tentacles and krakens, where it is what is interacting with the party, not the main party of the beast, which means they can't kill it. All they can do is fight and run from it or figure out a way to delay it. Also, remember that whenever you're running one-shots, especially when you try and do horror campaigns, having a little bit of material that you can remove out, either removing out that extra level of the catacombs or maybe a few of those undead encounters that are there more for filler than their main antagonist, is a good thing to be able to remove so that you can keep to your timed deadline for the group. There's actually a book that I had to go find again that's called Trajectory of Fear by Ash Law. And in it, he goes over the fact that fear is like a roller coaster. And he also goes into define these things that I always considered just to be like that unease and leading up to the actual fear. But it does a good way of explaining it for you. And your unease is the knowledge that something isn't right. It's realizing that you go into a house where there is some toys spread around. There's no children. Or, no, those people don't have kids. Or vice versa. Going into a town and there are no children anywhere. It's something that the characters will pick up on that's not right. Doesn't have to be a jump scare or anything. It's just that unease that sets you up. And then the dread is that it's the suspense. It's knowing something is not right. And then it's this idea that you know something is there. You know that you have this thing that you're having to deal with. Terror, as he puts it, gets that from where whatever you're dealing with hasn't been completely revealed from you. It's like the tentacle idea. It's these attacks that you can't get a hold of, that you can't deal with, and that you're not able to do anything about. That's what brings real fear to your table. And then generally, as his roller coaster stated, you dealt with the horror, which was when you actually deal with the creature itself. It's when it's there, because generally your players are going to be less frightened once they encounter it on the table than what's leading up to it. It's building up that suspense and the unease and the dread part of finding things out of place, finding people missing. In movies like Aliens, per se, while it has that sci-fi setting, it is a better example of leading up, where it's not just the bad guy appearing and then running off, but where you get, these strange things found, these eggs found. There's the encounter. There's this lead up. And then it goes through this cycle like a roller coaster again, with the face huggers and the unease and the unknowing with the players. It's a good example of leading up to their main event and then being completely overwhelmed. Eventually, they're able to stop it, but it's a good example of what you can do and then keep them through the motions, through that unease, and raising the tension and lowering it so that you can have them keep that experience in dread for as long as possible. And I'm not really one for just doing blood and gore because it doesn't really impress me that much when it comes to doing a horror game. I just don't find it to be very scary on its own. Descriptions is another thing. Bloody descriptions are fine. That tackiness, that smell of copper, that unripe smell of fruit. These are good things to have in your kit. There are some great lines that throughout novels have been really good that will capture an audience, that give that unease, that dread. Knock by Frederick Brown is the last man on earth sat alone in a room. There was a knock at the door. Using your description, not to just show everything in the world and be too descriptive, but to set this mood. And I use a virtual tabletop, so I'm going to have some slight background sound to most anything that I do like this, but I'm not going to rely on it. Your description as you go through it is going to be better than you putting some candles in the room and turning out the light, making it hard for your players to see their character sheets and hoping that your little brother gets through the candy bar that you paid him so that he can jump out with a mask on and scare your party at the right time. I recommend investing in the story and the description rather than the gimmicks, because it will get you farther. And even if you have to pause, it will still be there. Making the players wonder is the best thing. But also, another thing you need to do is give players a way out without fighting. So you can have the monster that they figure out in some way is sensitive to light or to something else. Holy water, a certain kind of steel, something for them to learn to get past or to be able to defend themselves with whenever they have that overwhelming threat presented to them. And then when they're without that comfort, it's going to increase that nervousness, that dread that they're going to have. This is seen with things like vampires. No one hunts a vampire at night. I mean, that's just something that most of your players are going to automatically try and do, is hunt it when it's weakest. Well, if they don't know, then they have this fear. When you give them something like the sunlight or something else, then you can still take it away. And then it's night. And it brings back that dread, knowing that there's something out there, knowing that they're being hunted. And that is what it's really about, is to get that feeling into your players, that tension. But I recommend reading some of the horror books. You can find lots of horror books, either from Stephen King, Dorian Gray, kind of Dracula. I mean, it's the season. We're all going to be watching horror movies, or we should to some extent. But another thing you need to do is, when you watch the movies, realize that the game is not a movie. That the players, they're not going to make those really bad choices. It's not the girl that gets the phone call and then runs away from the house and in the wrong direction, or hiding behind the chains in the guy's garage while he goes and gets a chainsaw. Your players are going to try and think smart. And even if you can keep that the unnerving feeling and that dread up, your players have more at their disposal. This is why I said it's easier to do this at smaller levels, because trust me, as they get higher in levels with more spells, it is a lot harder for you to instill dread without either breaking toys or taking some of them away, which usually means you're going to use some tactics, which I tend to use in my party anyway, just to make them feel like they have to find some other way to deal with it. Another thing when it comes to GMing horror games is, I know, especially playing in Pathfinder with all the options and races and everything that I have, taking away things from the players would make it much easier for me to be able to have a horror game. If everyone ran human and no one had any way of seeing in the darkness, it'd make life much easier. But unfortunately, that's not what you're probably going to run into. So we have to remember not to try and take away too much from our players. And I'm always fine with having magic not work for a certain period, or having something that they have to work around, kind of like a new mechanic or a new problem that they're solving. But I wouldn't take it away entirely, whether it's going to be a weapon or whether it's going to be their ability to use magic, blinding a character just to make him deal with having to be blind. And so it's funny because now he can't see. That's probably going a little too far. I might do a one-shot that I might record before the end of this season for horror. I might be doing Foxglove Manor. I think I'm going to convert it to 5e. So if anyone wants to see that, either DM or tell me in the comments below, and I might post that up somewhere. But I have a fairly new 5e group that I think would love to run it. I just have to convert. One thing I should say, whenever you're doing a horror party, and you can find Reddits of this, there's always the person, party member or DM, that takes it too far. One thing you need to do is run by a horror game by your players and know what content some of them are not comfortable with. Because doing things where you have certain people die or die in certain ways, or children description. I have done adventures or games where I had cannibalism and all sorts of stuff, and they involved anything from children to being either a victim or being the perpetrator themselves. So while using these taboos is a great way to draw on that unease and emotion, you need to make sure when you cross the line, because one, you don't want to make someone feel so comfortable that they do not want to play, and two, you do not want to go against sensibilities. That is why there are certain things in my games I normally do not showcase, and that usually comes on certain kinds of force used against other individuals, and anything that, since I know most of my parties, anything that is going to make them feel uncomfortable in that way. Just remember, everyone's there to have a good time. They want to be scared or made uneasy, and so just don't make it a bad experience for them. And like I've said, it's difficult for us to do this type of a game because you're trying not to give in too much. You're trying to put hints. You're trying to control the tension. So it's going to rely a lot on your ability to communicate the environment and the mood. If you like this video, check out my others. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. If you have any tips or requests, drop them in the comments below. And until next time, may your crits be epic, your adventures legendary, and your gaming table filled with laughter.